With me now, a friend of Pope Francis is a philanthropist, investment banker, John Studzinski. John, thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances. You knew him personally. You spent a lot of time with him over the years. What was he like?
He starts every conversation the same way he started the conversation with when he first became Pope, which is he starts off saying, "John, you must pray for me."
Every time you would see him,
quickly, but I also quickly got to know there's a sort of an Old Testament side, a very formidable, stern side, which we see in his early career, and then there's also a very New Testament side, which is very rigorously...
I like it that you put it in biblical terms like this.
Well, there is an Old Testament side and there's a New Testament side, very much mimicking the face of Christ, the life of Christ, the empathy, the sympathy, the humanity of Christ.
The moral force that he has, the caring for the poor, the caring for those who are the least cared for by many societies around the world, where did that come from in him? Was that always there?
We can start with the Jesuit. The Jesuits, as you know, are take the view that Ignatius of Loyola, you transform society by focusing on the poor, the poorest of the poor, the marginalized, educating them, training them, taking the scriptures, teaching them to fish, giving them the dignity of work. You also have to remember he's the first Pope from Latin America. His background, his history, everything that he saw and everything he represents has seen a wide range of economic conditions. So he's been very mindful of that.
We were talking before we went on air about his sense of humor. That was something you would see in private meetings with him.
No, he loved to play tricks.
Tricks?
Well, in small groups of people, he would sometimes pretend to be very serious and then all of a sudden say something outrageously silly. Mm-hmm. He was particularly used humor when he met heads of state. I found when he was going to meet a head of state, he was always ambivalent about that side of his job because he felt his real job is to be out preaching, saying mass, but also he was very focusing on building bridges among faiths.
Was that part of the reason, sort of the pomp and pageantry, was that frustrating for him? Because it seemed like he tried to reduce that as much as possible. He drove around the Fiat, didn't live in some of the places others had lived.
No, that was genuine. That was genuine. He had nothing, had no interest in that at all. And I think part of the deal was that he was going to always have a very simple life that focused really, and when you looked at his daily calendar, he did his day job in the Vatican, he spent part of his afternoon, he went to St. Mary Major and prayed himself in his own chapel there. That's a place where he's going to be buried. And then he quietly went back to the guest house, Santa Marta, and some evenings he'd eat on his own, and other evenings, if he was in the mood, he'd join a table of guests and sit and eat with them. It's a very lonely thing being a pope. There's very few people you can be close to.
That must be incredibly hard. It must be incredibly difficult in that sense, the weight of that.
There's the weight of it. He's got an extraordinary number of talent, people around him to rely on, and to a certain extent he's accelerated the talent to a number of people, and at the same time he's restructured a good portion of the Vatican, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that over the next several months as part of his legacy.
Do you think he waited for Easter? Do you think he waited for the day after Easter? Do you think he was obviously he'd been very, very sick when he was in the hospital.
Easter is the most important day. The resurrection of the Lord is the most important day in the Catholic Church, in the Christian faith. And I think he felt, as the servant, as Jesus' representative, as the chair of St. Peter, it was his job to be present, and particularly for the Easter Vigil, which is the most important service in the Catholic calendar. The night before Easter, where the entire faith is recited, where you recite your baptismal vows, you have the consecration, you have the entire Old Testament, New Testament. It's a very, very powerful ceremony, and he was present there in St. Peter's. And then, of course, he was present, I think, much to the frustration of some of his minders, on Sunday in St. Peter's Square.
As a believer and as somebody who knew him and also has done a remarkable philanthropy throughout your life, are you sad on this day?
I'm sad for the world. Is creating this enormous void of moral leadership. He is one of the great moral leaders of our time, and there's no one who's going to be able to fill that void in the present. I'm happy for him because he gets to go home. He gets to go home to the Lord. And I think as someone who's very devout, where faith is your anchor, it's wonderful to see him. His journey is probably complete. And again, to die the day after Easter, the day after the resurrection of the Lord, that's probably the most. A number of cardinals have said around the world today, you couldn't pick a more apt day to go to the Lord.
Vice President J.D. Vance met with Pope Francis just yesterday. The Pope also met with the 3 U.S. presidents who were in the Oval Office during his papacy. With us now is historian John McGreevy. He is the provost at the University of Notre Dame, its second-ranking official. Thanks for joining us. So after his election in 2013, Francis's pontificate spanned the terms of Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and then a little bit of Trump again. Joe Biden, the only Catholic of them all. Talk to us a little bit about his relationship with all 3. Let's start with Trump, who met him in 2017.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. The relationship with President Trump was somewhat antagonistic. Francis was the first pope from the global south. And as such, he was focused on a lot of the issues that Catholics in the global south are focused on, including migration and environmental issues, among other things. And of course, Francis's view of migrants, that they have basic human dignity, that they need to be supported, was challenged in some ways, especially not so much even by the actions, but by the rhetoric of President Trump. So there was some tension there, even if there were sympathy on other issues. But there was real tension on some of the issues that were core for Pope Francis.
How about his relationship with President Obama? Obama was president when Francis was first elected in 2013 and when he visited the United States back in 2015.
Even judging by the statement that President Obama released this morning, it was a very warm, as far as we can tell, relationship. Now, on the one hand, President Obama was very pro-choice. Pope Francis, of course, is very pro-life on the abortion issue. On the other hand, on issues like climate change, which was crucial for Pope Francis, on issues like, as I said before, migration, Pope Francis and Obama seem to see eye to eye, and the relationship, by all the accounts we have, actually was quite warm, and that was reflected in President Obama's statement this morning.
And then, of course, there's Joe Biden, who, after John F. Kennedy, has been only the second Catholic president this country's ever had.
One of the ironies of the recent past in the relationship between the Vatican and the U.S. is that President Biden was the most Catholic president we've ever had, a very faithful, practicing Catholic. But because of his pro-choice views on abortion, there was a lot of antagonism to President Biden from within the Catholic Church in the United States, but not so much from Pope Francis. Again, Pope Francis is very pro-life, but he and Biden clearly saw eye to eye on a number of other issues, and they were able to develop a quite strong working relationship. And again, you saw that this morning, too, with President Biden's very warm, very enthusiastic statement. Those of us who watched the State of the Union addresses, we could always see in the background there when President Biden was giving his State of the Union, a big photo of President Biden and Pope Francis, which at least I think symbolically suggested the importance that President Biden placed on that relationship.
Yeah, the Oval Office addresses with that photo. When we speak of Catholicism and politics, you've noted that the fight over abortion rights has colored the relationship between popes and Democrats and Republicans in some ways for decades. Do you think that abortion will remain the top issue when it comes to relationships that the United States president has with the Pope, drowning out economics, treatment of the poor, migration, or the environment? Or do you think it's just, it depends on the Pope and it depends on the day?
A little bit depends on the Pope, depends on the day. And of course, we have to see who's elected as the next Pope. But I actually would add that American politics has changed too. In the post-Dobbs environment, The issue of abortion has been more firmly placed in the states. It's less of a national political issue, although it is still somewhat national. And in that context, too, I think other issues are going to come to the fore, and they include migration, they include climate change, they include the kind of economy we have and how that protects the dignity of the poor, which was such a big issue for Pope Francis. So I do think the constellation of issues is going to shift a bit.
John McGreevey, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Joining us now, Father Thomas Reese, a senior analyst for Religion News Service. The reaction I had when we were watching Clarissa's piece is I said, wow, what a busy schedule he had on his last weekend, even though he was 88 and very sick. He was meeting with the vice president, doing Easter blessings. I mean, very, very busy.
No, this is a man who wouldn't stop. I mean, he wanted to be a pastor for people, and he wanted to do that to the bitter end, and he did. He made it through Holy Week. He celebrated Easter with his people, with the people of Rome there, and gave them his blessing. What better way for a pastor to go than right after serving his people?
You wrote about the moment you found out Pope Francis was elected, 2013, I believe, in your column today. You were not thrilled at first. Tell us about that.
Well, he did not have a great reputation. There was a lot of fear that he was going to be a very conservative pope. In fact, he fooled us all. He turned out to be very open, very progressive, and allowed the church to have more discussion. One of his characteristics that I loved about him was that he was very anti-clerical. He hated clericalism. He told the bishops and the priests, don't act like princes. Be with your people, listen to your people, love your people. And that's the kind of pastor he was, and that's the kind of pastor he wanted priests and bishops to be.
You also wrote in your column, quote, no matter who is elected, the impact of Francis on the papacy will be long-lasting. Like Vatican II, he has opened windows that are difficult to close. For folks out there who don't know what Vatican II is, a lot of changes were made in the church. You got a little bit away from Latin, etc. This is in the 60s, I think, right? What windows did he open that are going to be difficult to close?
Well, I think he opened up the church for more discussion, for more dialogue, for more conversation. Instead of saying, this is the way it is, don't ask questions, and if anybody disagreed, they got fired from their seminary jobs or whatever they were doing. No, he liked discussion. That was probably a Jesuit characteristic of him. He liked argument. He liked discussion. He felt that that's the way knowledge grows, is when we have these kinds of conversations with one another, and it shows a respect for one another rather than shouting and screaming at everyone, as I'm afraid we see too often in American politics.
Absolutely. Some hopeful progressive Catholics thought that he might allow women to be ordained. He might do away with celibacy norms for clergy. Neither of those happened. Did he not agree with those changes, or was it just simply not the right time for him, do you think?
Well, he never said. I think that for him, what was important was the process, that the way the church comes to these kinds of decisions. He felt it was necessary to have a longer conversation. The church is a big institution, over 1.3 billion people, different cultures, different experiences, different attitudes. And he wanted to bring anything that the church does that's major and changing, he wants the whole church to come to a consensus on this before it moves ahead. And so that's why he started this whole synodal process of conversation in the church, rather than having it all be simply a top-down decision-making process.
I wanted to get your reaction to part of Matthew Walther's piece in The Atlantic today, which is titled The Real Legacy of Pope Francis. Walther writes, quote, the possibility that the church might come to be regarded as a mere compassionate NGO was among Francis's greatest fears. For most secular observers, the church remains what she was before Francis assumed his office, a reactionary cult synonymous with sexual abuse. Again, that's not my language, that's from Matthew Walther's piece. But you did mention sexual abuse, that scandal, that horrible situation in your column today. What do you make of that take?
Well, I think that Pope Francis, like so many of us in the church, didn't quite get it at the beginning of his papacy, but he learned very quickly. He went to Chile and really said some dumb things. But then he learned that he had been misinformed. He had been lied to. And he got angry. And he demanded the resignations of all the bishops of Chile. And, then he sent out the message to the bishops, you protect children or else. Now, that was extremely important to do that and to send that message out there so that we don't do this, allow this to happen again in the church. So he was not perfect, but he sure was improved a lot.
Father Thomas Reese, we should note you have a book called Inside the Vatican, published in 1998. If people want to hear more from you, they can check that out. Thank you so much. It's an honor to have you here.
Good to be with you.
Really appreciate it. And we're back with our Faith Lead and lights off moments ago at one of the most iconic landmarks, the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France, where the lights were dimmed to honor Pope Francis, who died this morning at the age of 88. While the Vatican already is beginning its final tributes in Rome, leaders of the Catholic Church are also looking ahead to the process of choosing the next pope. Let's bring in CNN Vatican correspondent Christopher Lamb. Christopher, what do we expect to see over the coming hours and days?
Well, Jake, Pope Francis in death is continuing to show he was reforming the papacy. He has simplified the burial and funeral rites for the Pope. He said he wants to be buried in a simple tomb with simply Franciscus on it, and that he's covered the cost for the burial as well. So we are expecting on Wednesday for the Pope to be laid out in a simple casket, an open casket in St. Peter's Basilica, and then the funeral to take place some days after. And of course, in the coming days, cardinals from across the world will be gathering in Rome. They'll want to attend the funeral, and then of course, their minds will quickly be turning to the conclave and that very weighty moment of decision when they have to choose who will come after Francis and elect a new pope.
And who might replace him?
Well, I think the big question for the cardinals is what direction do they want to take the church? Do they want to continue very much in the Francis mold, to continue the reforms that he has started? And they might therefore look to a candidate such as Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines. He represents the growing church in Asia that Pope Francis has prioritized. They may want to continue with the Francis reforms, but perhaps in a more cautious way, and go with a more institutionalist candidate such as Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State of the Vatican. And then, of course, there's a possibility that there'll be forces trying to take the church in a very different direction to Pope Francis. There are, of course, those who are not happy with the way that Pope Francis has led the church. However, I don't see them as a strong majority in the conclave because, of course, Pope Francis has dramatically reshaped the College of Cardinals. He's appointed the vast majority of the men who will elect his successor. So I do expect them to move to continue in the line of Pope Francis, but it depends in what way and what kind of candidate emerges in the coming days of discussions.
Out front now, Cardinal Timothy Dolan, the Archbishop of New York. Your Eminence, I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you on such a sad day, although I know in some ways such a miracle that he was able to live these weeks after his hospitalization. I know you knew him, you attended his conclave, and you spoke to him many times. What did he mean to you?
Well, Aaron, first of all, I'm the one who's grateful. Thanks for having me on. It gives me the chance to thank the community for the tremendous outpouring of affection and sympathy. So it's good to be with you. What did he mean to me personally? A lot. So I think about the worldwide impact. I think about the impact on the wider church. I also have to think about the impact on me. I mean, when you get a phone call from the Pope when your mom dies, when your brother-in-law gets a letter signed by the Pope, handwritten by the Pope, because I told the Pope that Fred was dying of cancer, when he called me during COVID and said, how's New York doing through all this? When he called me on October 7th and said, how are our Jewish friends doing in New York after the vicious attack? This means a lot. He was a Pope with a big heart. I'm not surprised that it was the heart finally went. And it was interesting, Aaron. between among all these last months of suffering and frailty, the physicians would always say, his heart is very strong. And I thought, you bet it is. His heart is strong. His heart is big. His heart breaks with the suffering. His heart bursts with love for people. And we're going to miss him, a man with a heart.
I will never forget being on Fifth Avenue across from St. Patrick's Cathedral, Cardinal, when he came down, and just the crowds. There's this rare moments in this line of work where you see people gathered for joy. That was one of them. And Easter Sunday was so remarkable. You mentioned his frailty, Your Eminence, and he found the strength to be there. It almost seems as if he wanted to get through that day of rebirth and regeneration. He blessed the crowd gathered at the Vatican, but he was out of breath. He could only read a few phrases of his address, and it actually made me think, Cardinal, back to in March when he couldn't speak yet, when he was trying to recover, and he described his frailty as a blessing. He said it was an opportunity, this was the words that he put out in his prayer, to share in body and spirit the condition of so many sick and suffering people. And I wonder, Cardinal, as you think about that, it's such a fraught moment in our world, what impact does his letting us see that, his weakness and his dissent, what does that have on all of us?
You're on to something, Aaron. He allowed us, we obviously watched him live and live beautifully, but he also allowed us to watch him die. And he wasn't embarrassed by his suffering. Look, what is the universally acclaimed symbol of Christianity but the cross of Christ? Jesus, we believe, was most powerful at his weakest moment when he suffered and died for us on the cross. And that's what Pope Francis believed. He taught us that just being alive is actually more important than doing stuff. He wasn't able to do all the stuff that he wanted to do, but he just wanted to be with his people. You have this as physicians are saying, look, Holy Father, you got to stay away from big crowds. So yesterday, the last day of his life, he's driving in an open Jeep and through 200,000 people who were sneezing and cheering him. He said, look, I just want to be with my people, and the Lord will take care of me. And that's that love and that dare and that boldness that endeared him to so many.
I know, Cardinal, that after you speak with us tomorrow, you're going to be leaving for Rome, and you'll be there for the funeral and for the upcoming conclave when the cardinals, and you among them, one of the 135 who will vote on who will be the next pope. I'm curious, I had recently read his book, My Life, which I found quite profound in its simplicity. And he takes issues on not just migration, which he took on migrants, right? And he wasn't afraid to be political when he needed to be, but he talked about an era of conspiracy theory and propaganda and fake news and artificial intelligence. He took all those issues on. And he wasn't afraid to be in the moment. I'm curious as to how you see where the church should go from here. Do you want to see that same presence in the moment from the next pope?
Yeah, Aaron, you're on to something. He reminds me very much, and only us old timers are going to remember Pope St. John the 23rd. He was pope from 1958 to 1963, and he was very much Pope Francis was very much like John the 23rd. And John the 23rd had a famous saying. He said, the church must be able to read the signs of the time. The church is not of the world, but she's in the world. And Francis, like, we've had magnificent popes, my Lord, that we can all gratefully remember. But he had a unique ability to kind of be very savvy about the things of the world. Somebody said to me today, Aaron, said, most of the time we expect the popes to kind of lift us up to God. And Francis did that. But this lady says to me, he kind of brought God down to us. And that, of course, is what we Christians call God becoming one of us, taking flesh. And I thought, she's on to something. This Pope not only lifted us up, but sort of brought God down to our level. So he takes all these issues in the world. He's not afraid of them. And he has wise commentary about them. It's like the world was sitting next to him on the front porch, listening to your grandpa, sharing wisdom, because he's been through it all. And he's aware of God's design and God's will and wants to share that wisdom with us. That's what he was. And I think that's going to be essential. We got to keep that. in the man who occupies the chair of Peter next.
And we're looking at live images in Buenos Aires of people praying here, obviously in the early mid-evening hours now. And I remember growing up, Pope John Paul, during the getting my confirmation at that time, as the church was going through some pretty seismic changes, right? And here we are now in a world where, if I'm correct here, Your Eminence, of the 135 cardinals who are going to be voting on the next pope, 80% of them, the vast majority, 108 of them, were appointed by Pope Francis. I mean, that is something when you think about what he cared about, issues that he took on, and maybe he didn't go as far as some of the church would want on issues of abortion or gay marriage, but for civil unions and supporting LGBTQ. What impact has he had on the church already, with so many of those cardinals having been chosen by him?
You hinted at it. See, every time he appointed new cardinals, I had to run to my bookshelf and get the atlas to find out where most of these nations were, from
Wow.
where my new brother cardinals were coming from. This is great. He had a great sensitivity to expansion, to inclusion, to diversity. He loved that. He didn't want any language, any racial background, any geographic area to be unrepresented in the life of the church. This is a legacy that's phenomenal. Keep in mind, in 2013, I was honored to be part of that conclave, so that this will be my second time at the plate. At that time, 95% of the cardinals had been appointed by either John Paul II or Benedict XVI. Yeah. So, but that doesn't really kind of have a huge bearing on how they're going to vote. What will have a huge bearing is where they're from. They're aware of the grassroots. They're aware of the good things and, darn it, the challenging things that they face in these corners of the world that are unrepresented. He always said he wanted to go to the side of the road. And did he ever? And did he ever?